When do we feel moments of national pride? We may feel it a bit every day, but there's a reason the biggest expressions of this pride come from moments like the Olympics or the World Cup. It's because we all feel like we are participating in the writing of the story of a moment for our nation. Now, these moments don't have to be sports related, as we feel these points of pride from shared cultural stories as well, especially origin stories like on Canada Day or the 4th of July. But what happens when a nation has forgotten these stories? This is the problem that J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, was concerned with. He wanted to write a story that he could dedicate to his country, England. Now, I know what you're thinking. England, the country with the tremendous empire and the vast power and influence? How can that country be lacking on stories for national pride? Well, the answer to that comes from understanding that being British is not the same as being English. Britain is a much larger country with an empire that once encompassed the known world, but now includes just 4 nations, and England is simply one of those 4. Because of this, many stories for British national pride are shared with the rest of the nations of the empire, and there's very little just for the English. Now, Tolkien was a professor of Old English, and because of that, he understood that England's stories were not its own. In fact, because of the various conquerings and wars that took place in England over the years, very few English legends remained unaltered by the outside world, and some were simply imported. Tolkien, writing after World War I, was seeing at the end of the British Empire, and he sought to write a story for England. Now, I try to answer the question that anyone who's ever seen or read The Lord of the Rings has had. How come they didn't just fly the eagles on their quest? Well, the answer to understanding that comes from understanding the interplay between Tolkien's goal for creating a myth for England, the genre of fantasy, and the mode of walking. Fantasy has 2 functions. The first is escape. Life is hard, and we read and watch fantasy to get away from that for a while. The second function is recovery. It's not enough to just get away. You have to go there and back again and return to reality having learned something that makes it easier for you to deal with your hard life. Walking functions in a similar way. Great walking poets like Wordsworth and Thoreau were reacting against a society that they saw as rigid and restrictive. They thought that simply by going for a stroll, you could escape the rigid constraints of that society just for a while and rediscover the elemental truths of the world. Things like beauty, truth, and goodness are all things that a person can experience on their own, and the walker embodies this spirit. By writing a fantasy story where his characters walk, Tolkien allows his readers to escape the rigid constraints of a British identity and rediscover the elemental truth of what it means to be English. So why is this important? Because today, as we see the rise of toxic nationalism around the world, it's important to be able to point to examples of healthy nationalism. We can feel our national pride by rediscovering the shared cultural stories we've all experienced as a nation, rather than by building walls to keep out those whom we think don't belong. The works of J.R.R. Tolkien are an example of healthy nationalism, as he invites his reader to rediscover their Englishness just by inviting them to come for a walk. Thank you.